Today's daf we're going to learn is Nazir daf Nun Gimel. I'll already tell you that today's daf is a bit longer and complicated, but tomorrow's daf, the Shabbat daf, is only about 17 minutes. So it's good for you for a Shabbat daf to know that it's short. It'll be up soon after the Shiur, so you can listen. Again, one of the things I just want to start off with, and we're going to find it in this daf as well, that's complicated in Nazir. Besides, number one, there's concepts that are complicated. Especially now we're dealing with purity and impurity, which is not a simple topic to understand. Certainly with our modern eye, we don't even understand these kind of concepts as much. The second thing that's complicated, as I've mentioned many, many times throughout this Masechet, is you can see a lot of these sugyot were not fully edited properly or not in the way that other sugyot are, in the way we might be used to from other sections of the Gemara. We talked about how Nazir and Nedarim are a bit different than other Masechtot. And as a result, we're going to see today a bunch of situations where the main idea that they're trying to get at isn't even mentioned in the text, and the commentaries have to kind of add it in because the text doesn't make much sense to them and they have to fill in details. And it makes it more difficult for the learner because it's better when we can often, in a good sugya, it's very well organized and you can see the beginning, start, and end and what the middle is and how it all works. In these kind of sugyot, it's a little bit more challenging. So I will put that out there just to kind of encourage you that if you're a little bit confused from this, understand that the commentaries were confused by this as well, and the sugyot don't work as perfectly as others. Anyway, that's just some introductory material, which also leads me to remind you all that we're actually finishing the Masechet very soon, less than 2 weeks, and the Siyum registration is up on the site. Rabbanit Leibowitz is going to be speaking about hair and why the significance of hair, which is always a good opportunity to go more in depth than we get to go during the regular class. And we're going to hear from Goldie Gilab, one of our learners, actually on the Zoom with us. So that's our Siyum. Let's get started now. We had this question of Rami Bar Hama. Rami Bar Hama asked, Rova atzamot min hashidran gugolet. So he says the following. The question is quite simple. Shidran gugolet, whether we say, okay, it really doesn't matter how you read the sugya. The sugya is either whether we say shidran and gugolet together, both the spinal column and the skull, or separate. That's not the question here. But either which way, however we answer the previous sugya, which we didn't answer, which way does it go? But the question is the following. We saw in our Mishna that in order to be impure, in order for the Nazir to shave, which is code word for, right? And we'll just keep using these words because that's the way the Gemara calls it, which means that if the Nazir is impure in this manner, then the Nazir will have to shave. Right, besides getting out of his status of impurity, she will also need to shave all their hair and start the Nazirut from the very beginning. So Rami Bar Hama says, in our Mishnah, it says a half a kav of bones. And now he wants to know, though, generally a quarter kav is matame, but for the Nazir to shave, it's a half a kav. Remember, we already saw that on Chloket, Tosfot. Rambam, whether it's only a derived law about the rova, the quarter, or is it a Torah law according to Tosfot? Either which way, generally you're tamei with a quarter cup. But the Nazir doesn't have to shave if he becomes impure to a quarter cup. To which the Gemara wants to know, what if it's a quarter kav of the shidran gugolet? When we said quarter kav, we meant quarter kav of bones in general. That's not going to mess up the Nazir in terms of starting all over again and all the other, and the shaving, etc. But maybe a quarter kav of shidran gugolet, the shidran gugolet are so significant in the body that already we saw in the Mishnah, shidran gugolet, maybe a quarter kav of a shidran gugolet will be mitameh. To which Rava said, well, then it should have said so in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah said shidran gugolet. It should have said quarter kav of bones of shidran gugolet. Now, which is bigger, right? If you do the simple math when you're a kid, what's greater, 30 or 3, right? So here there's quarter kav of bones and an entire quarter kav of skull and an entire skull. Obviously, an entire skull is larger. So comes Rav and he says, if we want to say a quarter kav was impure and messes up the Nazir, it should have said quarter kav. It would have been obvious a full skull. So obviously, quarter kav is not a problem. Right? It would only be a half a kav like everything else. To which the Gemara rejects Rava's answer and says, but wait, starting at the top of our daf, Rava says elsewhere, we don't really know where Rava says this, but Rava says there's a whole debate. Okay, this is again another thing that's not so clear. In fact, I saw a footnote that said this is of the most unclear sugi as possible, because they're going to quote something Rava says, they're going to quote something Rabbi Akiva says. Some people say maybe it was Mar Ukva, it wasn't Rabbi Akiva. Nobody really knows where these statements were made, but let's just take it as assumption that they were made somewhere. Rava himself said that when it says Shidran Gugolet, what are they referring to in the Mishnah? Right? We said, obviously, a quarter kav is less than a whole Shidra. Now we're going to say, no. The Shidran Gugolet mentioned in the Mishnah is actually less than a quarter kav. Why? Because he said the Mishnah is referring to a Shidran Gugolet she'ein b'hem rov atzamot. They're so small, they don't even have, like we talked about from a nefel, from a miscarriage, let's say, or from a stillborn, where it's so small that you don't even have a quarter kav of bones. And yet it's still going to create impurity because it's an entire unit of something significant in the body. So once you say it's less than, then you can't say it should have said the lesser amount. You would have known the larger amount because this is the lesser. I'm sorry, you could have said the lesser amount and then you would have known the larger amount because this is the lesser amount, okay? In other words, you couldn't have said Rova Kav is actually greater than what it says in the Mishnah. And therefore, you don't know it doesn't teach you anything about Rova Kav. So what their question is really like this. Their question is, how could Rava have even suggested this? Rava was basically saying Rova Kav is obviously less than Shidra. And now we say that Rava said somewhere else that Shidra is actually less than Rova Kav. So how could Rava have even suggested that answer? It makes absolutely no sense. So which the Gemara says, well, he said it, Batar Deshama mi Rabbi Akiva, or maybe Mimar Ukva or something. But basically, this is Rava talking in two different times in his life. First, he suggested this is an answer to Rami bar Hama. Later, he learned from Rabbi Akiva that the Shidran Gugola mentioned in the Mishnah is actually smaller than the Rova Kav, and then he couldn't say this anymore. So basically, we reject Rava's answer because we say that in the end, Rava's answer was said in an earlier time, and he changed his mind after that and couldn't have used that argument once he changed his mind. So answer number one rejected, and we're going to also reject answer number two. Answer number two is going to come from the same source we saw yesterday, and it's going to be rejected the exact same way we saw yesterday, which is Ashma, Shamai Omer, Etzem Echad min hashidra u'min hagugolet. Shamai says, even one bone from the spinal column or from the skull will be metameh. And again, our first assumption is that the rabbis don't disagree majorly with him. They only disagree minorly. So if he says etzem, one bone, we can assume that the rabbis jump up one level and they say not one bone, but a quarter kav. Okay, that they agree that Shidran Gugolet is different. They just don't think that one bone, you would need to have a certain minimum measurement. But that minimum measurement is going to be different than every other limb, which would answer Rami bar Hama's question is, yes, there is a difference. And Rova Kav would be tummy. To which they say, no, not necessarily. Shane Shamai de Machmir Tfei. We could say that Shamai himself is super stringent. And he and the rabbis differ entirely. He says one bone, and they say, no, regular amount. You would need chatzi kav, half a kav, not a rova kav. So in which case the Gemara says exactly as we did yesterday. If you're going to say Shamai is very stringent and the rabbis differ tremendously with him, well then, then there's our answer to Rami bar Hama's question. Tama de Shamai machmir, hala Rabbanan adika chatzi kav atzamot. And then the answer to Rami bar Hama is, there's no difference between Shidra and Gugolet. It's the same as everything else, chatzi kav, and not a quarter kav. To which they say, no, because you can also say, maybe they only differ slightly. In other words, we don't really know what they say because they don't appear here. So it's exactly the way we said it yesterday. Perhaps the rabbis only disagree with him about one bone. But maybe they would agree with him about a quarter kav. So we're back and forth. We in the end say we have no idea. Okay. Shammai says one bone. The rabbis say something along the scale, either quarter kav or half a kav, in which case we have no answer. So we're left without an answer to Rami bar Hama's question. Next, which shouldn't bother us because we've been left without answers to a lot of questions. Which, by the way, shows again lack of clarity, right? They didn't have answers to a lot of these questions either, which is interesting in and of itself. Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Now we're going to get and I charted this out on your sheet, so if you have the study guide, it's helpful to look at. Rabbi Eliezer says, Kinim harishonim. We're now going to talk about historically the debate about this change. Okay, now what's our debate? Now our topic is Rova Kav Atzamot. Okay, now we're going to see later, we're going to have a little bit of a change about this whole thing. But right now, we're assuming we're only talking about a pile of bones in an ohel. Okay, ohel means a few things. Ohel means if you're in a house or a tent or something with a dead body or kazayim in a maid or right, any of those things we saw in the Mishna that are matame ba'ohel and magam masa and by touching or carrying. But if you're in a closed space and that happens to be there, you're not even next to it, but you're under the same roof, then it'll be tame. You'll be tame. Okay, that's number one. And then it means, number one, okay, we'll go through a few topics. You can't eat truma. You can't eat, right, that's for the kohanim. You can't eat kodashim. If you brought a sacrifice and you want to eat the sacrificial meat, you can't eat that if you're tame. You can't bring a korban Pesach if you're tame. And the Nazir will have to shave, cancel all his days, right? A Nazir is not allowed to become impure. See, my internet's not great. I'll wait a minute and see if is it better now? Do you hear me now? Let me know if it came back. Yes? Okay. So, and then we have I don't know where I froze, but I'll go back. We have a Nazir who has to shave and basically cancels his days, impurity to a dead body, right? So impurity in a tent. And then we have a korban Pesach also, right? You can't bring a korban Pesach if you become impure to a dead body. So now, those are 4 topics that we're going to discuss. And what we learned so far is, in our Mishnah, a Nazir doesn't shave, meaning doesn't have to go through the process, if it's a quarter cup, but yes, for a half a cup. We don't know what the law is about other truma and tara, that we said a little, maybe there's Torah rabbinic differences, but that doesn't interest us right now. The question is practically on the ground, what do we do in what cases? So Rabbi Eliezer is bringing he's a Tana, and he's going to say the following. There was a debate about these different topics and the different measurements and where they applied and when and what and whatever. We'll see right now. We're going to have 2 stages. And within the first stage, there's going to be a machloket. In the earlier stage, miktsatan, some of the rabbis, there was a split. Some rabbis said this, some rabbis said that. We're very familiar with that. The shiur is half a log, half a kav, okay? Half a log of dam, of blood, half a kav of bones. That's the shiur. And for everything is going to mean the 4 things we just said: truma, kodashim, nazir, pesach. Rova atzamot urevi'itam lo lakol. But if it's a quarter kav, doesn't apply to any one of them. Okay, no one's going to be messed up if they come in contact with a quarter kav of bones or a quarter log of blood. Umiktsatana yomrim. But then there was a second group of rabbis who said, af rova atzamot urevi'itam lakol. Everything is us. Quarter kav, right? Quarter log, and obviously half, right? Once you're matame to that, for everything. So the first stage, there was only distinction between possibly quarter log and half log, and this is all in a tent. We're talking laws of tents, not touching, magamasa, we'll talk about that later. But if you're in contact with quarter kav of bones in a tent, okay, there's quarter kav of bones in a tent, or on the ground and you pass kind of over it, you put your body over it, that's also called ma'ahil. You're ma'ahil on the mate. It's like you're making a tent over the bones, you will become tameh because the truma goes up. Okay, now, in all these, plus there's other examples of ohel, but I'm just leaving it at that. Nobody distinguishes between somebody might become impure for truma, but not a nazir, right? This won't make a nazir have to shave. Nobody makes that distinction in the earlier stage. The earlier stage, everything is in the same category. Okay, nazir, kodashim, truma, pesach. But at a later stage, beit din shel achareihem, the court after that, though, at some later stage, we don't know when, amru, chatzi kavatzamot b'chatzi log dam lakol. Everyone's going to become impure if it's a half a log or half a cup. Okay, even the Nazir, right? Everyone, it's a problem. But rova atzamot urevi'i dam. But if you have a quarter kav of bones or a quarter log of blood in a tent, litruma ulekodashim, it will be a problem. Okay, if you're a Kohen, let's say, or you're a person who wants to eat a sacrifice, you become impure to the dead in this manner with the lower amount, problem. Aval lo lenazir v'oseh pesach. But for the issue of Nazir, and now we add to the issue of Nazir also Osa Pesach. Someone who wants to bring a Pesach sacrifice is not prohibited from bringing the Pesach sacrifice because of this kind of impurity. This is a weaker kind of impurity. It's impurity that says don't eat truma, don't eat kodashim, but it doesn't prevent you from doing the Korban Pesach. And if you're a Nazir, you don't need to shave. By the way, what's the similarity about the two? If you can't eat truma or kodashim, we're just stringent. Okay, don't eat something. But these other two, if you don't do Pesach, you're going to be chayav karet. If we say the Nazir has to shave, then it means you bring sacrifices, which maybe you're not obligated in, right? Whenever we talked about it, maybe you shave your hair when you're not allowed to shave your hair. So there's all sorts of halachic problems in the other category. So because it's this in between, we're going to split and say truma kodashim yes, and Nazir aseh Pesach no. So now the assumption is that Rabbi Eliezer is basically saying we hold like the later ones, because why else would he be bringing it other than to say things changed? And now we go by this. So which the Gemara asks an interesting question on him. Michdi ein achra'ah shlishit machrad. This is a good promo for Rabbanit Leah Sarna's class this week. Okay, this week she's going to be talking about halacha from the Gemara. How do we learn halacha from the Gemara? And theoretically, you might have assumed there's all these halachic principles. And one of the things she's going to tell you, I'll give away a little bit, is that there's no real principles. There are some principles, but they're always kind of broken. Okay, there's no real, not like a scientific method. So here the Gemara says, there is some principle here. The principle generally is that when you have two people who argue and a third comes and sides with one side, okay, again, this doesn't always prove right. That's why I was kind of couching it in the beginner's Gemara class and the one on halacha coming up this week. By the way, if you missed your classes, they're all online and you can always listen to them. So one of the principles here that they're kind of addressing, even though they're not saying it straight out, is that if you have two opinions and they disagree, and a third one comes and proves one side, right, kind of strengthens one side, brings a proof, or says, I hold this way, well, then that tilts the balance and you have two against one and we go by the two. But in this case, the third opinion here, that this is the words, ein hachra'at shlishi machra'at. Machra'at, la'achriya, is to decide, to say, I hold like you. In this case, we end up with the third opinion doesn't side with either opinion. It made up its own thing. And they basically say, Rabbi Eliezer, how can you be holding like this third opinion when the third opinion made up something that neither of the first two opinions took? So while on the one hand, we like to follow the later authorities, which is another principle, halachic principle. Halakha kebatrai, we often follow the later ones. But what happens with these two approaches here, and then a third one came and kind of made something up out of the blue and made up a distinction that didn't exist to the other two. So this isn't, I'm deciding like one or the other, I'm making something new up. And it seems to me like it's not so much that they're bothered that we don't end up with this third opinion, this machra'at that, kind of says, oh, I hold by number one, and therefore 1 and 3 are together and we're going to hold that way. But it's more so when you see the answer, I think they're bothered that it kind of sounded like something new. We don't love always new things in the Gemara unless they're grounded in some sort of tradition. And the answer here is, Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, mipi shmu'a amru. These later rabbis didn't just make this up and say, oh, let's come up with a distinction. Let's distinguish between Nazir and Pesach and truma and kodashim. No, they had a tradition. And not only that, they go so far as to say, which is a very extreme statement, I think, these were the last of the prophets. They want to say this is back to the time of the prophets, almost like this is a tradition from God, they're trying to say. And right, it's probably an exaggeration. It probably didn't go back all that way, but they're basically trying to say, don't think they made something up. This is really steeped in tradition. And they probably really wanted to strengthen that opinion and against people's questions, like where did they come up with this, and say it's steeped in tradition and goes all the way back. Okay, they don't say Mimoshe Messinai. It's a good question why they don't say that, but maybe, it could be they really did have a tradition that went back that long, but most of this halacha developed later than Chagai Zechariah Malachi, and therefore it's not so likely that that's the case. But anyway, that's what they say. So let's just review for right now before we go on. We started with this question of Rami bar Hama, Rova Atzamot, is that should we say by Hadran Gugolet that there's a unique halacha that quarter kav of Atzamot are already going to be mitame? And we said, we don't have an answer. We tried 2 attempts. We didn't get to an answer. Came Rabbi Eliezer and said this whole distinction. I'll just say it in other words. the whole distinction between Nazir, that even though in regular truma, rov hakav is going to make you impure in a tent, when it comes to a Nazir, if there's a rov hakav of atzamot in a tent, you'll become impure, but you won't have to shave and you won't bring the sacrifices and it won't be the same. It'll be more like the next Mishna, which we're going to see soon. That we'll see on Shabbos' daf. Let's see, which is tomorrow. Okay. Al elu hanazir megalech. Now we're just going to do a very small language thing in the Mishnah, which is, the Mishnah started off, let's go all the way back to Mem Tet Amud Bet. We've been dealing already with this Mishnah for a few days. Al elu, on these things, on elu tumot, and these type of tumot, and nazir megalech. And then it gives a whole list, blah, 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 the meit, the chatzi zayit, the kazayit, the kazayit netzel, the malot harav rakav, the review, the shidran, the gulgolet, the ever min hamed, and the ever min hachai. We'll get to those today. The chatzi kavatzamot and chatzi logdam, which we've been dealing with. And then it says, al maga'an, al masa'an, ba'al elilam. All these are tummy in three ways. Oel, touching, and carrying. Then it says, al etzem kiseora, al maga'o, al masa'o. And if it's just a bone the size of a barley grain, well, that's just maga and masa. But yes, the Nazir will have to shave for those as well. Al elu Nazir megalech, and then it tells you what you do. You shave for these, and you do blah, blah, blah. Okay. So the word al elu appears in the beginning, on these, and then it says later, on these. Very weird. You don't need those words at all, and why would it say it twice? So al elu Nazir megalech, al elu dereisha, lemiute etzem kaseora. The first al elu means on these. These usually means these and not others. What it's trying to say is, now, really in the end, they're not adding anything new. You would have, that's why it's a bit of a weird sugya, because in the end, all these things are obvious anyway. But they want to stress to you that category one are all oel, maga, and masa. But there's one, which is etzem kaseora, which is not going to be matame in an oel. So they want you to make sure that you understand that. So they say on these, he's matame, and those are also ohel. Don't confuse it with etzem kaseora, which is only by touching or carrying. So if you have a teeny little bone in a house, that's not going to make everything in the house impure. And the second, al elu deseifa, the second time it says it, is lemiute even hasachuchit. Sachuchit is a very strange word. Sounds a lot like zichuchit. Anyone knows Hebrew? It means glass. And some people say what it means to tell you is glass does not carry impurity, which is very interesting hypothesis. Some people suggest that, and others say, what are you talking about? Who says glass doesn't carry impurity, which is fascinating that they don't know whether it does or doesn't from anywhere else. I don't know. There's a whole discussion about that. I didn't go in depth to understand it, but I was thinking about how some people use glass dishes for milk and meat. So it's interesting. Anyway, most people do not think that that's what this means, and do not think that glass is not impure, susceptible to impurity. And the second is, by the way, I see someone saying we tovel glass, but toveling now is not for truma and tara. I mean, it's sort of, but it's because of the giulei nocholim, right? It comes from the Torah where we have to tovel pots. Anyway, whatever. I don't want to get into tefillah and all that right now, but we're not toveling it for impure. I don't think so. Okay. Anyway, that's a good question. So now most people say it's sichuchit. Sichuchit is from schacha, which is in our next Mishnah. And it's basically coming to tell you, and that's if something is, actually, there's a debate because there's chachot and praot. Some people say it's the praot, even though chachot, you would think it's that. Anyway, we're going to see that in tomorrow's daf. It's either a tree leaning out or a stone leaning out, and there's purity, there's something dead underneath it, and then there's a whole thing about it. Okay, that's a small thing. Anyway, we're now going to basically say each al elu is coming to make sure we understand that there's distinctions here. It's a little bit strange because it's pretty clear, these distinctions. That's the benefit of the zichuchit, is that's something not mentioned in our Mishnah. And to say al elu is coming to include something additional, that would make more sense. But the first al elu isn't coming to say anything additional, and therefore it makes sense to say the second al elu isn't really either. It's just kind of making sure you know there's these delineations between the categories. Okay, not the most convincing. Again, some of these sugyot are a little bit hard to understand. Yes, so schacha, exactly, Tina. It comes as a cover, like a schach. That's what it means, a covering, something to, right? Okay, and that's the root of that word, exactly. Hatzi kavatzamot. Okay, so again, we did question of Rami bar Hama, okay, and I'm not at the end of class going to go back to this, so let's just review before we get to Amud Bet. Question of Rami bar Hama about rov atzamot of Shidran Gulgolet. Then we got to debate about, right, over time it changed, this whole thing and this distinction that Rova Kav is Mitame in other areas, but not in Nazir and not in Pesach, seems to be a later development, and that there is this distinction. And the Nazir, what this Al Elu is to come and kind of delineate that there's different categories here. The Chatzi Kav Atzamot. Okay, here comes the complicated part, because they're going to learn something that doesn't really say so in the text. It's actually going to be based on something we're going to learn later. So I'll already kind of preface this by saying, even though we've been talking about Rova Kav and Chatzi Kav, and it seems pretty clear till now that Rova Kav is not Mitame and doesn't mess up the Nazir. In other words, he's Tameh, but doesn't mess him up. He doesn't have to start from the beginning. It's in the next category of Mishna. It says it explicitly. But we're now going to assume, and the Gemara will learn it a little bit later in the stuff, but since we're premising our next sugya and our understanding it on this assumption, I need to tell you now, which is they're going to assume it says Revi Dam in the next Mishnah. It's not really necessary. If it says Chatzi Kav in the first Mishnah, you are Megalech. It's obvious that Reva Kav, you wouldn't be Megalech. So you don't really need to put it in the next Mishnah where it says on these things the Nazir doesn't shave. So therefore, they're going to assume, again, they're going to assume that Revi Dam in the next Mishnah that says the Nazir is not Megalech is only Revi Dam or Rova Kav, the Rova Kav Atzamot. I'm talking about the bones, my mistake. The bones in the next Mishnah is only in a tent. If you have a pile of bones and they're Reva Kav, quarter of a Kav, in a tent, the Nazir doesn't need to shave. It doesn't mess you up. Okay, again, you become impure. You have to go through your purification process, but you don't need to shave. You don't need to bring sacrifices, and you don't need to cancel all your previous days. However, if you touch them or you carry them, a quarter Kav, you actually will be impure and it will mess you up, and everything of this Mishnah applies, even though it doesn't say so in our Mishnah. That's an assumption. So now the Gemara is kind of asking about that, even though the words don't really sound that way. But that's how the commentaries explain this, because otherwise it makes no sense. Because you're going to see, they're going to compare it to Etzem Keseorah. Now, Etzem Keseorah is only a line touching, okay? And it's going to be obvious that this is the only way to read the sugya, or maybe there's another way, but hard to read it without assuming that that's what they mean. So let's read it inside, and then I'll tell you what they really mean here, how they understand it. So Chatzi Kav Atzamot in our Mishnah, on half a Kav is what you're going to have Ohel, Maga, and Masa, which is going to assume Rova Kav you won't have Ohel, but they're going to assume you do have Maga and Masa. Chatzi Kav Atzamot in, Rova Atzamot lo. So again, Rova Atzamot lo means quarter Kav of bones. You will not have a problem in an Ohel, but you will have a problem, again, you have to add these words now, but you will have a problem if you come in physical contact with it. Maga, Masa, okay, either by touching or by moving it without actually touching it, okay, like it's on a tray, for example. So they say, Hechidami, what's this case? Now that's why it's unclear here, but what's this case of Rova Atzamot that you'll be liable as a Nazir for carrying or touching? Now let's, again, what's greater than what? Obviously, etzem keseorah, the size of a barley, is going to be a lot less than a chatzi kav, than a rova kav, than a quarter kav. Quarter kav is a much bigger measure than one teeny little barley. So what's the use in telling us that a quarter kav of bones is mitame b'maga or masa? Again, it never said that explicitly, but they inferred that. What's the point of inferring that and telling us that if already etzem keseorah is a problem? Once it's the size of a barley, it's going to be mitame by touching or by coming, right, by moving it. So obviously, if it's bigger than that, it's going to be a problem. So that's what they're saying here. If it's bones like the size of barley, so it'll already be a problem because of etzem keseorah. So what do they answer? So what's this? Why are you telling us, again, they haven't told us yet, but they're going to tell us later, that a quarter kav of bones, if you touch it and you're a Nazir, it messes you up completely. You'll have to shave, bring the sacrifices, etc. So the answer is elade ikmach akmuche, coming from the word kemach. What is kemach? Flour. What's flour? A powdery substance. When we say etzem keseorah is mitame b'maga, we mean a bone the size of a barley. Now, the bone the size of a barley has to be a bone, not a crushed up bone, not ground up into flour. It has to be a bone. So it's a bone the size of a barley. But if you crush that bone into bits and you have a barley size shape of it, it will not become impure because of etzem keseorah. But if you, right, so if you touch that powdery substance, you don't become impure. But if it's a reva kav and you're a Nazir and you touch it or you move it, right, carry it somehow, then that's what the chidush is here. It's coming to tell you that a quarter kav of crushed up bones, again, we're back to, why anyone would do that, I don't know. But if you end up with bones that got crushed somehow, and then now in a tent, no, but if you touched it or moved it, you'd be liable. Okay, that's the chidush, that's the unique halacha about this reva kav that we're going to see coming. Now, it's going to come up kind of as a side comment through this next sugya. We're now moving to Ever min hamet and Ever min hachai sheyesh alehem basar karoi. This sugya we're going to start today and finish it up in tomorrow's daf. So now we have, according to our Mishna, it says a limb from a dead body or a limb from a live body that has enough flesh on it that if it were still attached to the body or if the person was still alive, it would scab. Okay, if it's not enough, like you need enough skin to scab or enough flesh. Otherwise, right, it won't scab with just a little bit of skin. So, or a little bit of flesh. So, en alehem basar karoi mai. Now it says, as long as it has enough flesh on it. What if it doesn't have enough flesh? So, if I would ask you this question, what would you tell me? Obviously, the Nazir doesn't need to shave because it says, if it has enough flesh. Why else would it be telling you that if not to say, if it doesn't have enough flesh on it, you won't become impure, and to the extent that you'll have to shave and bring the sacrifices. But that's not what the sugya says. So the Gemara says, what would be if it doesn't? And machloket, Rabbi Yochanan amar, Nazir megalech alehem, as you would have expected. No, he doesn't shave for them. Reish Lakish amar, Nazir megalech alehem. That seems like a strange shita. He says you're anyway going to need to shave, even if you have a limb from a dead body or a live body. If it doesn't have flesh on it, you still need to shave. Meaning, again, it's high-level impurity here. So let's try to figure out. Well, Rabbi Yochanan's pretty obvious where he gets it from. Rabbi Yochanan amar, Eno Nazir megalech alehem, tehakatani bereisha, because of what it says in our Mishnah. In the beginning of our Mishnah, it says, Al ever min hamet, al ever min hachai, v'chulei, right? Sheyesh that has enough meat, flesh on it. Sheyesh alehem basal in, ein alehem lo. Seems pretty clear. Only if it has, otherwise, why would you bother saying that? So that's a pretty clear proof. So obviously, what's Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish going to say? Reish Lakish going to say, so Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is Reish Lakish. Migalech. Why? Midelo katane b'seif. Because it does, okay, now, first thing to know is they're talking about, again, even though it doesn't say this, maga, okay? Only by touching, not in a tent, okay? So now they come and say, well, what does it say here? Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, notice it doesn't say it in the second part. Now, what's the second part? So in the next Mishnah, it says, these are the things she'ein hanazir megalech, right? And notice, it doesn't appear there. Okay, let's just quickly read. Schachot, praot, beit hapras, don't worry that you don't understand these things. Eretz amim golal dofet, revi itam oel, rova atzamot, bekelim anogim b'mei, to b'mei safro, b'mei gamlo, al elu ein hanazir megalech. And what's not mentioned there? Ever min hamet, be'ever min hachai, that doesn't have basar kara'oi. So since it's not mentioned there, if it was supposed to be in the category of you don't need to shave, then it should have been in the Mishnah that said you don't need to shave. So comes Reish Lakish and says that's your proof. The Rush actually says it comes from the Seifa. Okay, Seifa means the end of the Mishnah, but it doesn't always mean the end of the Mishnah. Sometimes it means the next Mishnah. So that's how we understand Seifa here. The Rush actually explains it as the end of the Mishnah. And he says, since it's not in the second part of the Etzem Keseorah, right? So he says, well, Belokatane ein alehem basar kara'oi lemaga'o lemasa'o. Right, no, that's Rabbi Yochanan. Sorry. Right, Rabbi Yochanan says because it's not there. Right, there's a debate about where Rabbi Yochanan says it's not. Okay, but anyway, that's okay. So now, Rabbi Yochanan, what's Rabbi Yochanan going to say? So according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, it must be you shave because it's not in the Mishnah where it says you don't shave. So now Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Lecha, Rabbi Yochanan could say to you the following. How's Rabbi Yochanan going to relate to Reish Lakish's question? Why doesn't it appear in the next Mishnah? So he has an obvious answer. Anything you can infer, there's no need to say it in the second part, right? In other words, sometimes we have Mishnayot that are very clear. They say this, that, and the other thing like this, and this, that, and the other thing like that, even though it's not really so necessary because it's kind of obvious. Comes Rabbi Yochanan says this second Mishnah is not stating the counters to the first Mishnah. Anything from the first Mishnah that's clear, this but not something else, isn't mentioned in the second Mishnah. And it's just obvious. So yes, Ever min hameit that has, right, and Ever min hachai that has basar karoi. You didn't need to say in the second Mishnah, it doesn't have basar karoi. That's quite obvious. Okay? So Rabbi Yochanan will say that you didn't need to say. So basically, let's just be clear about their proofs. Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't, right? Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't appear in the next Mishnah because it doesn't need to appear in the next Mishnah. And it's quite obvious because it says, if it has basar karoi, if it doesn't, then obviously the Nazir is not going to shave. That seems the most obvious. Reish Lakish says, no. If they wanted to say en Nazir Megalech, they would have said so in the next Mishnah. So now they're going to ask some questions on Rabbi Yochanan. Even though Reish Lakish is the more surprising, the questions are on Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, you want to say right now, if there was no need to write it, they wouldn't write it. Well, there is something mentioned in that next Mishnah, which there was no need for. Ha chatzi kavatzamot. Right? What did it say in the first Mishnah? Chatzi kavatzamot. And in the second Mishnah, notice what it said when I read it. Rova atzamot. Now, if chatzi kavatzamot, the Nazir needs to shave. It's obvious that a quarter kav of atzamot, the Nazir doesn't need to shave. Nachon? Obviously, because otherwise, why would it say half a kav? So they're going to ask Rabbi Yochanan on that. Chatzi kavatzamot, the mashma chatzi kavatzamot in rova atzamot lo. It's pretty clear from the first Mishnah that rova kavatzamot you wouldn't shave. V'katani b'sefer rova atzamot, and it says rova atzamot. So here's going to come what I kept saying before. Now they're going to derive from the fact that rova atzamot appears here and it doesn't need to. We're going to derive that it's coming to teach us something unique. Hatam ilav rova atzamot. If it didn't say rova atzamot in the next Mishnah, what would I have thought? Havamina afila al magao masao lo. You would have thought it says chatzi kav atzamot in the first Mishnah, ohel maga masa, right? So that seems to say a rova kav, ohel maga masa, nothing, right? You wouldn't need to shave. Well, lahachi itzterich lemitne rova atzamot, to teach you. Why does it say rova atzamot in the next Mishnah? Because the next Mishnah is referring to things of ohel. It's to teach you al ahilanu de'ena nazir megaleh. It's to teach you that the Nazir doesn't shave on rova atzamot in a tent, even though the word tent doesn't appear there. But they're going to assume it's talking about, because even the case chachot and praot are talking about tents and all that. So maybe there it's all about tents. But maga umasa, you would be. Okay, the Nazir would have to shave on maga umasa. So that's how he explains the next Mishnah, and that's how we get to what we were asking before on rova kavatzamot. It was obvious to us that maga was a problem, and then we said, well, why etzem k'seora? And in the end, they said, well, if it's crushed up. Okay. Now, here's the second question against Rabbi Yochanan. What about the chatzi log? Ha chatzi log dam d'shamat mina chatzi log dam in revi'it dam lo. What about the quarter log dam mentioned in the next Mishnah? What are you going to say about that? Why is that mentioned? That's totally unnecessary because it already says half a log is a problem. Obviously, quarter log is not a problem. So why is that mentioned? V'katani b'sefer revi'it dam. So why does it say that? To which they answer, hatam afuke Rabbi Akiva. Now I'm going to skip the next few words. The Gra and others take out the next bunch of words here, okay? Because the next bunch of words seems to be talking about some other machloket of Rabbi Akiva, which is not the relevant one. Apparently, Rabbi Akiva thinks that when it comes to a quarter log of blood, it will mess up the Nazir in a tent. And what our Mishnah had to stress it, even though it's obvious from Mishnah 1, Mishnah 2 had to mention it because they wanted to be clear that we don't hold like Rabbi Akiva. So since there's an opposing opinion, they had to mention. So each time we have to find, since Rabbi Yochanan's whole proof of the Aver min hameit that doesn't have any extra flesh on it, right? Enough flesh that it could heal itself. The Nazir does not shave. And why is it not mentioned in the next Mishnah? Rabbi Yochanan basically says the next Mishnah only mentions things that you couldn't have inferred otherwise. And then we said, well, Rova Kav and Revi'it Halog, we could have. So each one we gave an answer. Rova Kav is to teach you. Rova Kav is not Matame Oel for a Nazir, but it won't, again, mess him up completely. But it will mess him up if he touches it or moves it. He'll be exactly like the first Mishnah. And with the Revi'it Dam, we needed it because there's an opposing opinion, and we needed to say, clearly we don't hold like Rabbi Akiva. We wanted to make that very clear. So that's all how Rabbi Yochanan reads those two cases in the next Mishnah, in line with his line of thinking that Mishnayot don't need to mention things that are very obvious. And even if maybe in other places they do, in this Mishnah for sure they don't, and then he has to explain why it seems like they are mentioning unnecessary things. Now we end with this last question, which we're really not going to get to the answer until tomorrow. Well, we'll get to the answer, but we won't see where he gets the answer. Now we're back to this thing about etzem kiseora. Again, we're going to have the same question as before. What's a rova kav that's matame b'maga if already etzem kiseora is matame b'maga? So same kind of thing here. If it's the size already of a barley, this bone from a limb, right? We have a limb that's made up of a bone without enough flesh on it that we're going to say is matame anyway. Okay, now we have a machloket. We have Rabbi Yochanan who says it's not matame. And we have Reish Lakish who says it is matame. Again, it's matame, but I just want to be clear. Every time we say it, it's Nazir megalech. Does the Nazir need to shave or not? So Rabbi Yochanan says the Nazir doesn't need to shave. Well, if it's a limb and it's a bone from a limb, it's obviously bigger, right? So now the question, is it bigger than a barley, this limb? If it's bigger than a barley, then my Talmud Rabbi Yochanan, then it obviously the Nazir shaves. Because already we learned from our Mishna. Etzem keseoraz matame b'magan, the Nazir needs to shave. So if we have a piece from a limb of a dead body or a live body, it doesn't matter what, and now it's bigger than a barley, right? Certainly from a mate, he would have to shave. So Rabbi Yochanan makes no sense. And and if it's so teeny that it's less than a barley, my Talmud Reish Lakish. Why would Reish Lakish say this is a problem? Now the obvious answer is going to be like we've said before, which is since it's in a complete limb that's less than the size of a barley, right? But it's a complete limb, it's anyway going to be a problem. And that's what we're going to say according to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish could say, we're putting words in his mouth, but he could explain, there's a special drasha in the Torah that's telling us that a bone, a limb, that's the size, right? That's even smaller than the size of a barley. Again, very hard to imagine the reality here. But because it's a complete limb, it would have to be on like a newborn infant, very teeny. Because it's a complete limb, therefore, it's going to, again, by touching it, okay, by moving it, you will become impure, okay? And if you're a Nazir, you'll need to shave. That's Reish Lakish's approach. Where does he get this from? He's going to have a special drasha in the Pesach. Now, the drashot are going to come from Braitot. We're only going to see the Braita tomorrow. We're going to start with the Braita. And the way the Gemara is setting it up now is, remember, our topic here is maga, because we keep comparing it to etzem keseora. We're talking only about touching or carrying. We're going to have one Braita about oel, one Braita about maga. The Braita about oel, which we're going to start with, has nothing to do with our topic. It's just setting up. These are things that are impure in a tent, versus the next Braita, which is going to be these are things that are impure by touching or moving. Now, the reason why they're bringing it here, the oil has nothing to do with it. So some of the commentaries say they always like to throw in stuff about Tum and Tara because they think you don't know it, and we don't have Gemaras on it. So they kind of strip it in when they can. So here's an opportunity. We're going to talk about Maga. Let's talk about oil first, and then we'll bring in the Braita about Maga, which is the relevant one. So the relevant knowledge, what we're looking for is a drasha that's teaching you that Ever min achai or Ever min amed, if it's a complete limb, even if it's smaller than a barley, you're going to be a liable Maga. Okay, or masa. And that we're going to get to in tomorrow's stuff. But right now we're going to start this at the Braita, and we're going to start with this pasuk. Anyone who comes in contact on the field, now the field we're going to say means oel, because you kind of walk over it or something. It's out there. So al pnei sadeh zehama hi al pnei meit. Okay, there's a whole pasuk here. We're going to darshan the parts of it. So al pnei sadeh means if you are in the field and there's a grave and you walk over it, you're basically creating a tent over it, and that's tameh. Bechalal ze'ever min achai. Okay, bechalal, if it's the word halal comes from like a body, and it's referring to a limb from a live body. Again, we're just doing drashot. V'yesh lo lahalot arucha, and it has enough enough flesh on it that it could heal if it were still attached. Cherev harezo kechalal. This is a unique halacha, a very strange one, that any metal implement, presumably a sword, okay, that came into contact with the dead body that maybe killed the body, but here it applies to any metal implement that touches a dead body, not necessarily the one that killed it. But from the word, it says halal cherev, which means a body that was killed by a sword. So from there, they learn that any metal implement that comes in contact with a dead body is mitame like the dead body. So if you come in contact with a dead body, your tummy is 7 days. If you come in contact with a knife from that touched a dead body, not even the knife that killed the person, a knife that touched a dead body, you're also impure 7 days. Even though usually a kli that came in contact with that is only an avatuma, which makes you a rishon, which you would only become a 1 day. It's a very unique halacha. There's a good footnote in the Kohen which said, very interestingly, can a Kohen become impure to this kind of thing? There's a machloket about it. We're generally lenient. It's not a problem. A Kohen can't come in contact with the dead body. What if a Kohen comes in contact with, right? That's also truma made because you become tamei 7 days. But because it's not the dead body itself, we're not strict about that. Anyway, oben mate, ze ever shenichlal min hameit. These are, by the way, just general laws of Tum and Tara. This has nothing to do with the Nazir specifically. Or bebait, what's mate? That's right. We obviously know mate. So they're adding, it's something that a limb that comes from a dead body. That's ever min hameit. O be'etzem adam, ze rova atzamot. What's etzem adam? Well, again, we're in the topic of oel. Oel, what's the measurement? Quarter kaf of bones. O bekever, ze kever satum. This is a halacha we'll talk a little bit about more tomorrow, but if you have a grave without airspace of a tefach above the dead body before, let's say, the covering, there's less than a tefach. It's basically as if there's no covering and all the truma goes straight up through the okay. If there's a covering and there's a space of a tefach, number one, it means all the truma is going to go to all the sides. It's like an ohel, but it also means that it blocks the truma from going up. Whereas if there's not a space of a tefach, that's called a halal tefach, that's a kever satum, the truma goes wherever the dead body is, go upward, everywhere up is tameh, because whatever cover is on, it doesn't block the truma from going out. Okay, and that's what we're going to see in the next few words of the Gemara. Like I said, this Braita really didn't prove anything to us yet. We're going to wait till tomorrow to get to prove our point. So we ended the daf with, on the second half of the daf, we talked about the Rava Kavatzamot is Matame Masa, and then we said, what's the case? Because already etzem on the size of a seorah, so we said if it's crushed up into a powdery substance, then it wouldn't be Matame because of a seorah, but it would be Matame because of this din, because of this law. Then we had the Ever Minamed and Ever Minachai Sheyesh Alehem Basar. What if they don't? And we had a machloket, Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, and everyone brought their sides. And then we said, well, how much are we talking about here of the, first we talked about it doesn't have enough flesh, but how much bone does it have? Is it less than a barley or is it more than a barley? And that we're in the middle of trying to prove how Reish Lakish says, even if it's less than a barley, still the Nazir is going to have to shave. And why is that? Special drasha in the Pesach. That's it for today. Today's shiur was a little long, but tomorrow's will be very short. So listen before Shabbat, hopefully. Have a great day, everyone. Shabbat shalom. See you on Sunday.